This is the most disturbing band in music history. Murder, death, chaos and destruction, followed by a lengthy prison sentence. And the band would go on to leave a legacy behind that would define an entire genre of music. A genre of music smeared by violence and all things evil. But before we start this epic journey and tale of self-discovery where we learn something new and come out the other end changed in some sort of way, we need to take a trip to Norway, in particular a place called Langus. And while we're at it, let's jump in Doc Brown's time machine and go back to 1980. Langus in Norway is only about 30 minutes outside of Oslo, the capital. At this time, it was a small, semi-rural community that was sort of developing, I guess, maybe more into the suburbs. It is known really for its close proximity to the forests and outdoorsy things, but it's still not a hotbed for tourism. It would be in this quiet, very closed off to outsiders community that a band would form. A band that would pay homage to Satan himself. Oystein Aarseth was born March 22nd, 1968 in the rural community of Surnadal. His father was an attorney and not much is known about his mother because they lived very private lives. It would be a few years after Oystein was born that the couple would give birth to another baby boy that they would name Nils, and this completed the family unit. It would be at a very young age when Oystein and his family would pack up and move 7 hours south from Surnadal to Ski, which is the suburb over from Langus. And I'm guessing the move probably had more to do with his father's work opportunities being so close to the city. It's during Oystein's childhood that he and the family attend church and he starts learning the violin. He would be enrolled in Finnestad Primary School where he was known to be a shy, quiet but clever little boy. In the town over in Langus, there were two students there who would grow up to be fellow band members. Kjetil Mannheim and Jorn Stubberud. Kjetil's father was actually the principal of Langus Primary School, while Jorn, on the other hand, was growing up in a fatherless household, being raised by a single mother. The two boys bonded very quickly over their love of music, in particular heavy metal and punk rock. Kjetil himself played the drums while Jorn played the guitar, so the two decided to jam together. And given the fact that Kjetil's father was the principal of this primary school, he allocated time for them to go and play in the music room so they could rehearse and practice and do the things that bandy type people do. In the town over in Ski, Oystein himself, he had ditched the violin and he had picked up the guitar and he was involved in some heavy metal projects of his own. Their paths would inevitably cross when they all graduated their respective primary schools and all started to attend a high school in Ski. It would be on the first day when Jorn would run into Oystein and he would ask him where the music room was, which he was in luck because Oystein himself was actually headed there. As the pair walked to the music room, they were talking about music tastes and the things they enjoyed, and turned out that both of them happened to be musicians. So Jorn said, "Hey, I've got a friend Kjetil who's at this school as well. He plays the drums. Would you like to come to a jam session with us?" To which Oystein said,
"Hell yeah, brother."
It was at that first jam session when Kjetil and Jorn were super impressed with Oystein because Oystein knew all the songs that they were playing, all the cover songs that they were playing at this time, which was the Dead Kennedys and Discharge and punk bands like that. So it's 1984 and the trio now decide to form their own band and they call the band Mayhem. The name was taken from a song on the 1981 Venom album Hell, which was called Mayhem with Mercy. But this time, instead of the lads just solely playing covers, they wanted to create their own music. And they wanted their music to be darker and more brutal than any metal band that had ever come before them. And inspired by the 1982 Venom album, Black Metal, that's exactly what they wanted to deliver on. They wanted to make music that the devil himself would listen to. Now, the boys would go on to give themselves stage names. Oystein would call himself Euronymous, Jorn, Necro Butcher, and Kjetil, well, he just used his last name. He called himself Mannheim. But many speculate that the reason he called himself Mannheim had to do with Norse mythology, which is something that plays out further as this story goes along, but personally I just think he used his last name. So the trio start rehearsing together and they're playing live as much as possible, usually in the school halls, garages and basements, because at this stage there is a little sort of community of metalheads sort of growing in the teenage sort of realm of things. Yorn, or Necro Butcher, he had moved over to bass because Oystein Euronymous, he was a much better guitar player, and they actually took turns in doing the vocals. And this would lead to a 1986 demo that they released called Pure Effing Armageddon, which was raw, very raw. Some might say shit, but not this guy on Reddit. He loved it. And when he was asked why, he said probably because he's on the spectrum. He's autistic. I mean, who isn't? I mean, I did those self-help tests too on TikTok, and turns out I'm on the spectrum. Maybe that's why I like metalcore. Now, there's no doubt that the three boys could play extremely well, but their intentions for this demo tape was to keep it lo-fi and extremely noisy. Which many attribute this demo tape as like the foundations of black metal. So I guess they achieved that. It's also around this time that the Satanic Panic is kicking off in the United States, and I do feel like that had a large part to do with the boys' sort of behaviour. So in 1980, this book is released called Michelle Remembers, which it was later debunked. It was about child essay during satanic rituals, which does exist, just not in the case of Michelle Remembers, apparently. Judas Priest himself would be dragged into a lawsuit by a 20-year-old who tried to unalive himself due to the subliminal messages he claims that were in the music. So he was saying that he and his friend went to the park with pew-pews and attempted. His friend was more successful than him, though. The Senate would also hold a hearing over the Filthy 15 is what they were labelled at, which AC/DC actually made the cut. But the hearing didn't go anywhere, like, you know. But to kids, it must have been super exciting seeing, like, all this sort of outrage by, I guess, the parents, the establishment. So I can totally see why young kids would sort of, you know, want to gravitate towards that. So it's 1986 and the boys just released their first demo tape. They continue performing around Lungus and they're taking trips on the train into Oslo, where there is more metalhead community sort of forming, so they can go there and play and stuff like that. And it's at these places where they do meet more and more musicians that are in the scene. A big thing at that time was tape trading events where they would take black metal cassette tapes and trade with other bands, because nobody was selling this stuff in shops. I mean, it was very low quality, so no one would buy it anyway. So they'd go and do these meetups, usually in Oslo and places like that, and they'd trade cassette tapes with other people who were making that sort of music. So it was a really good way of networking with other musicians in the genre. It would be at one of these tape trading meetups that they would run into a guy named Sven Erik Christiansen. And he was like a solo artist who basically just handed out tapes of him singing, and he meets Euronymous, who's super impressed with what this guy can do. So he's asked to join the band Mayhem, which he does, and he goes by the stage name Maniac. It's now 1987, and Mayhem release another album. This time it's called Death Crush, which was like a pretty decent thrash metal album of the time. It was still a far cry from what they would become, though. But just in 1 year, a lot would change. The founding member, Ketchel Mannheim, he decided to leave the band, which I'm not surprised because he wasn't really into that part of it. Like, he was like a punk rock drummer, and you can see in the photos, like, he's not dressed like them. He just looks like, you know, a normal dude standing next to a couple of zombies. And their new singer, Maniac, he would also either leave the band or get pushed out due to mental health reasons and addiction problems. And I do believe the reason Mannheim did leave the band was because he could definitely see the destructive path they were going down. Like, he didn't mind doing the theatrics on stage. I mean, it is a bit goofy, but he didn't mind that. But it seemed to him that Euronymous in particular wanted to do a lot of this stuff in real life. So he departs the band because he was right to do so, because it's only in the next several years that things get really bad. It would be in 1988 when they're at another demo trading swap meet when Euronymous runs into a young guy named Per Yngve Ohlin, known as Pelle. Now, Pelle is from Sweden and he plays in a band called Morbid, and he hands Euronymous a tape, and it's of him singing in Morbid, and there's also a picture of him which he's dressed all in black and he's got the white makeup on to make himself look like a corpse, and instantly Euronymous loves this. He sees this guy as potentially like, this is the sort of look he wants his band to have. It's very disturbing. But Pelle from Sweden has a very interesting backstory. As legend has it, when Pelle was just 10 years old, he was involved in an ice skating accident where he ruptured his spleen and had internal bleeding. He would actually die before the paramedics got there, and he would be revived in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. But it was during his death that he had an NDE, a near-death experience. And this definitely altered his perspective on life. And he would tell people of these events later on in life, but the truth of the matter is much more sadder than that. You see, Pelle didn't have a skiing accident. Pelle was beaten brutally by bullies, and that's what landed him in the hospital. You see, growing up, he was almost like an outcast. He was shunned by a lot of people, and parents didn't want him hanging around their kids. So he just sort of grew up a very lonely, depressive sort of child. But on this occasion, he was not rejected by Euronymous at all. In fact, he was embraced and welcomed into Mayhem. Now, Swedish and Norwegian languages are very similar, as I found out. It's a slightly different dialect, but they can understand each other, because that was my first big question. They're part of the Germanic Scandinavian language family, so they definitely could easily communicate with one another. So Pelle joins the band, and his stage name is Dead, and he moves down to Norway. And this is, I guess, the beginning of the real tragedy of this entire story. With the departure of Kjell Mannheim, they now had a new drummer named Jan Axel Stomberg, or he would call himself Hellhammer. And Hellhammer was a very good heavy metal drummer. So now Mayhem are starting to tour internationally. Well, I guess you would call it. They're going to different European countries like Germany and Sweden. They do still play in Norway, and I believe they were actually banned from playing in Italy. But by this stage, their stage presence had dramatically shifted. It became extremely disturbing. And this was largely due to their new singer, Dead. In fact, Dead would bury his clothes days before the concert so they would get all dirty and start smelling of rot, and then he would put them on for the show, painting his face like a corpse, and he'd get up on stage and he would self-harm. Yeah. And in fact, at one show, he went so far that by the end of it, he suffered so much blood loss, he had to be rushed to the hospital. Just don't do that. Come on. Now, the band is tickling into the 90s, and things, they're getting darker, and it's certainly going to ramp up a gear. Euronymous is really feeding off of Dead's antics, and it's getting more and more insane. Euronymous by this stage has developed almost like an elitism in black metal, where he believed that only he and his band and maybe a couple of other bands were worthy of calling themselves black metal bands. And it was several years prior, given the fact that, record stores weren't selling black metal tapes, that Euronymous decided to start his own record label, which he called Death Like Silence. And it would be in 1990 that he would open up his own record shop called Helvete, which means hell in English, and he opened that up in Oslo. So things are definitely moving more for the band, and Euronymous actually rents a farmhouse in Krakstad. It's on the outskirts of Oslo, and they would call this house Mayhem House, and Pelle, Dead, would live there full-time. Euronymous would live there part-time, but it was mainly the band's like HQ, so they would rehearse there, make as much noise as they wanted, and get super evil, and nobody was in cooey to hear it. But Dead by this stage, again, his antics are just ramping up. He's getting right into the black arts, and in fact, he starts finding dead animals, and he brings them into the house and leaves them in his room. Now, his room was this small room with a mattress on the floor with no windows and no light, and he would leave the dead animal there just so he could smell the decay. He was also obsessed with not eating and looking as skinny as possible. Now, fellow band members and people that had met Pelle or Dead would describe him as being a very depressive person. In fact, it made several people angry because he was killing their vibe, man. But for Euronymous, he was the perfect image for black metal. That's what he thought black metal should be. It should be this like Dead, and he, of course, himself. because he's always going to make it about himself. Now, although Dead was most certainly into the black arts, he wasn't a Satanist like the Anton LaVey type of Satanism. He didn't believe in organized religion. In fact, he preferred isolation over ideology. So with Mayhem's satanic sort of symbolism and ritualistic style, that was really driven by Euronymous, not Dead. But in the early hours of April 8th, 1991, things would take a devastating turn. And what would follow would become part of not only metal music history, but I think music history in general. Pretty much everybody knows this story to some degree. Sometime in these very early hours, Pelle, Dead, he gets up out of his room and he goes into the kitchen and he grabs a very large butcher's knife. He returns to his room where he slashes the wrist and the neck. It's while he's attempting to bleed out that he gets a pen and paper and he writes, "Excuse all the blood." And this is for what he is about to do next, because at this point he's extremely dissatisfied with how long it is taking him to die. Some people just have no patience, man. Pelle grabs a shotgun, loads it, cocks it, puts it to his head and pulls the trigger. It blows half his head off and his brains are now on the floor of his bedroom. Pelle would lay there until the next day when Euronymous showed up to the house to discover his lifeless body. Now, the normal thing to do would be to call the police. However, Euronymous, he decided to get back in his car, drive into town, go and buy a disposable camera where he drove back to the house, staged the scene, and started taking pictures of Pelle's lifeless, head blown off body. Now, I can't show that picture here on YouTube. You can Google it, but here is an artist's depiction of it by myself. So this is Pelle's body right here. When he shot himself, he took this part of his skull off. There's blood and brains all there. Now, the shotgun is slightly under his arm, and this is the knife that he cut himself with, which is slightly over the shotgun because Euronymous, he staged that. This is the wall. This is the floor, and this took place in his bedroom. Clearly, I am a solid artist. Now, it's while he's doing this that Euronymous makes several phone calls to friends telling them what he has found, and he's very excited about it. And one of the people he calls is the bass player, Necro Butcher, and he tells him, "I've just taken pictures, I've done this and that." And Necro Butcher tells him, "You better destroy that camera, destroy those pictures, I want nothing to do with you." And he actually leaves the band. So it's at this point that Euronymous, he calls the police, but before they get there, he decides to go and pick up parts of Pelle's skull. And what he goes on to do is pretty disgusting. In the basement of his Helveta record store, he used to have meetings with other death metal band members. And what he would do with Pelle's skull is he would make pendants and necklaces and give it to the inner circle that used to congregate in the basement of his record store. Euronymous would also go around and tell everybody that the reason Pelle took his own life was because black metal was becoming too commercialized, and he didn't like that, and he felt that it should just stay in this little pocket here and all this sort of garbage, which wasn't true because letters that Pelle had been writing to people were later released that proved that he did care about the band's success. He did care about record sales. So this was just a way Euronymous was really just trying to, like, I don't know, paint this picture that Dead and himself and Mayhem were the true and only real black metal band that has ever existed or will ever exist. So Euronymous was really just using Pelle's passing to promote himself in the band and push himself up to, like, iconic leadership status, I guess. In the aftermath of Pelle's death, Mayhem did go into a collapse because they'd now just lost two members. They lost Necro Butcher, the bass player, and of course Pelle too. So they stopped touring, albums stopped being made, and Euronymous really focused on his record label and his record shop. It would be during these times that Euronymous would sign multiple bands, and one of those bands was a one-man band called Burzum, and that was fronted by a guy named Oystein Vikernes. And Oystein Vikernes, he would go by the name Varg, and Varg was 5 years younger than Euronymous. He grew up in Bergen, Norway, which was about 7-8 hours from Oslo. His father was actually an electrical engineer, and for a time when he was about 6 or 7 years old, the family up and moved to Iraq because his father was contracted to work on Saddam Hussein's regime over there with something to do probably with computers or electricity, I don't know. But it was upon the family's return back to Norway that his parents actually got a divorce, and it did hit Varg very hard. In fact, he didn't really have much to do with his father after that, and he referred to him as a drunken racist, which was quite ironic. Now, Varg himself had played in several bands. However, he had never played live because he would tell people that, I don't perform, man, like this is just for me, whatever. But he did play in several bands, and he played guitar and he also played bass. So this is sort of where he comes more into the fold with Mayhem, because Euronymous wants to record an album and they need a guy who can play bass, so they asked Varg to do it. The album was currently in the works, but it would go on to be titled De Mysterious Dom Satananis, I think. And to this day, a lot of people call it the best black metal album ever made. But we're not there yet, because it's still sort of in the works. Now, things within this black metal inner circle that is like congregating at Helvete, they're getting pretty extreme. I mean, at one point, there was a band member from another black metal band bragging about killing a gay man, to which Euronymous really loved. He loved the idea of like, yeah, that's real evil right there. But things definitely get worse and worse and worse from here, but you can sort of see where it's all coming from. It's coming from this inner circle of this black metal community. Elitism, man, that's why I don't support it. But Euronymous, he didn't really foresee that things with Varg and some of these people, he was going to be on the outs for in the near future. But in the meantime, they were getting up to some pretty extreme acts. On September 13th, 1992, Varg and multiple members of this inner circle would go and burn down a church that was on the outskirts of Bergen. Now, they didn't just stop at one. By Christmas Eve the same year, Varg and Bard Ethium, he's a drummer from a black metal band called Emperor, they would torch another church, and these churches were super old. They'd burn them to the ground. And again, 6 months later, on June 14th, 1993, Varg again, with other members of the black metal inner circle, they would burn down yet another church. Now, police, in the aftermath of a lot of this stuff, they believe that Varg and these black metal heads were responsible for as many as 8 church burnings around the time. But we're not there yet. And the reasoning that they would give was like, it was such BS. It was like anti-Christianity and an attempt to revitalize ancient pagan Norse culture, which is like the worshipping of the god Odin. And there's like heaps of gods, but Odin is like the main god. And it was like back in the days when they used to sacrifice something to the god of weather, so they'd have a good harvest that year. And when Christianity took over Norway, it pushed that out. So this was what they're claiming was an attempt to fight back. But one of the churches they burnt down, they said they're reclaiming that land the Christians took. That church was a very old church, but it was torn down from another location and then rebuilt there, and it was privately owned. It was like a Norwegian monument at this point. So like they just didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. Now, as far as I know, Euronymous never actually took part in any of the church burnings. And people out there will argue the point, and maybe they are right, but I view Euronymous as probably more all talk, no action type of dude. Like, he loved the appearances of being evil, but I don't actually think he was. But he most certainly used the church burnings and old mate who'd murdered the gay guy, like, to his advantage to, like, see, we're the blackest, darkest, evil band that's ever existed. And not to mention, you know, Pelle's skull and taking pictures, and the pictures that he took were actually released on an album cover. I don't know if it was Mayhem or someone else that did it. Like, it's pretty sick stuff. But like so often in life, when you hang around dirtbags and you have a tendency to rip people off, like, you know, Euronymous was doing, because as it turned out, these bands that had signed to his record label, he wasn't paying them any money, or rarely paying them money for the album sales. So this is things are about to bite him in the butt real quick. It's August 9th, 1993. Varg was in a heated argument with Euronymous over his Burzum record deal with Euronymous' record label, and he was also complaining about not having been paid for the bass parts that he had played on the new Mayhem album, because at this time it's in production. Euronymous says to Varg, he says, "We will meet up in several days and we will sort all this out. I have the record contract for you. We will get it done." It's late afternoon and Varg decides, you know what? Well, that ain't good enough. And he and a band member from Thorns named Snore Ruck, he's a guitar player, they would get in a car, and from Bergen to Oslo is about a 7-hour drive. They would book it straight there. Varg wanted to confront Euronymous today. So the pair get to Oslo and they park outside of Euronymous' apartment. He's got an apartment on the 4th floor of this complex. It's around 3 a.m. when Varg goes up and knocks on Euronymous' door, who answers it, and he's wearing underwear at this stage because he had been asleep. Now, Euronymous lets Varg in, and from here, this is heavily debated as to what goes down, so I'll just tell you the facts, and at the back end, I'll tell you what I think. Euronymous, Oystein Aarseth, sustains 23 stab wounds, 2 to the head, 5 to the neck, and 16 to the back. As Varg is attacking him, he manages to get out of the apartment, but he collapses in the stairwell of this unit block, and it's there that he dies. Varg and Snore both leave, get in the car, and drive all the way back to Bergen. The next day, a resident in the building would find Euronymous' lifeless body. Now, Varg is back in Bergen and he makes a phone call to a friend who either owns another record label or he works there, and he informs them that Euronymous has been murdered. Now, this was super interesting because nobody knew at this point. So this record label guy is sort of like thinking, you know, how does he know this? But at the same time, I believe Varg is probably calling him because he maybe wants to get on that record label. Because why else would he ring him? And it makes sense. Like, you know, Varg's like, well, look, Euronymous is dead, so obviously I'm not going to be on that record label, so I'm free to be on yours. But unfortunately for Varg Vikernes, he would not get on that record label because he would be arrested just 9 days after the murder of Oystein Aarseth, Euronymous. Because it was during the autopsy that it was revealed that Euronymous had been stabbed multiple times post-mortem, so after he had died. So they knew that this was a very personal attack. And talk around Bergen at the time was that Varg had something to do with it, because a lot of people knew that Varg hated Euronymous with a passion, and Euronymous wasn't too fond of Varg either. And in fact, I believe it was one person who came forward who was part of the planning of this murder, because what he revealed to the police, it pretty much cracked the case, and I don't think this person was charged, and a lot of people don't know about him, but what he was instructed to do before Varg and Snore had left Bergen was he was given Varg's bank card and told to go to Blockbuster and hire a VHS tape or whatever they had back then on Varg's card to make it appear like Varg had never left Bergen. But the big problem Varg had was he did take gloves with him, but he forgot to put them on in the heat of the moment when he got into this, you know, murdering headspace when he attacked Oystein. He forgot to put his gloves on, and his fingerprints, his bloody fingerprints, were found inside and outside of the apartment. And to top it off, this genius Varg, he claims he's a genius, he had signed and dated the new record contract with Oystein Aarseth, with Euronymous. So, bro, they know you were there. So when Varg's downtown, his excuse is ridiculous. He claims that Oystein, that Euronymous wanted to murder him, wanted to tie him down, torture him, film it, distribute it, because Varg is running around with the whole thing that Euronymous took pictures of dead after he, you know, and that was sort of like, see, he's done it before. So he tells the detectives that when he was in there that Euronymous attacked him first and he was defending himself, and then Euronymous, he thought, was running to the bedroom where he had the shotgun that Pelle used, that Dead used on himself. He had that shotgun, and he had to make sure he wasn't going to get a shotgun, but then all of a sudden, he doesn't go to the bedroom, he goes to the front door, and this is what he really says. He says, I seen that, and I was so enraged, like this is supposed to be a fight to the death, and you're going to, be that cowardly, so he murders him. That's what he says. And Snore was actually outside in the hallway, too scared to, intervene, is what he claimed. But how ridiculous. How can you claim to be like a genius if that's your silly ass story? It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. So when Varg was arrested, they also found 150 kilograms worth of dynamite, other ammunitions and detonators, and also plans. They had written out plans to burn yet another church. So this is what helped link them to a lot of the church burnings. Again, genius. So Varg is charged with first-degree murder and illegal possessions of explosives and 3 counts of arsons for the church burnings. He would be convicted on May 16th, 1994 and sentenced to 21 years in prison. His accomplice Snore Ruck would also be convicted, and he would be sentenced to 8 years in prison. And as for that dude back in the record shop in the black metal inner circle who was bragging about killing a gay man, he actually did do 2 years in prison for that. Crime doesn't pay. It really doesn't. Now, here's the twist of the story, because Varg was sentenced to 21 years, which I think is a pretty light sentence for premeditated murder anyway. But he got released in 2009. He only served 15 years and 3 months of his sentence. Now, the weird thing about it is, Jesus, Norway, do something. It's ridiculous, because in 2003, Varg had escaped prison and was on the run for several days. And when he was recaptured, he had a firearm and camouflage. This dude was clearly not intending on ever going back. And just 6 years later, he gets released. What? Varg now lives in France with his wife and kids. He does make YouTube videos. He talks about how white people rule and every other race is shit. And he basically just lives a life of obscurity. Who cares, man? Nobody cares about this dude. And as for Oystein Aarseth, Euronymous, I really believe he was a savvy businessman. I don't think he was that bad guy. He did bad things, but who doesn't in business, right? His dad was an attorney, and I just feel like he was a chip off the old block. And from what I read, a lot of Oystein's lifestyle was basically funded by his father. So the record shop was funded by his father. The apartment in Oslo was also funded. His record label, it was funded by his dad. He was like a rich kid. He was a super talented musician as well. You can't look past that fact just because he played black metal and he wanted it to sound terrible, which he nailed. And I guess just to circle back to Varg, I think he's this controlling, narcissistic sociopath. And he wanted to be at the top of the black metal scene, and Euronymous was in his way. So I think that's really why he did it. And it probably had a lot to do with the fact that he wasn't getting paid the right amount of money for the record sales of Burzum, which from all reports sucked anyway. But he just strikes me as, when you meet someone who's so dumb, but they're so arrogant about it, they really think that they're not stupid and everybody else is. He sort of reminds me of that. Bro, you ain't a genius. Come on. Now, as for per Yngve, Ohlin, or Dead Pelle, he was just a depressed guy, and he had a troubled upbringing. After his parents' divorce, it really hit him hard. He was outcasted by a lot of people. I think it's a very sad story, and I think in a different environment, things would have most certainly gone a different way. But he met Euronymous, who really sort of encouraged that very negative, very toxic, very dangerous behavior. And of course, it was always going to end one way, and it did. And then again, Euronymous took advantage of that. So I don't think Euronymous is a very good guy. I don't think he should be hailed some sort of music hero. You just don't do those sorts of things. Now, Mayhem have reformed, and they do still tour now, apparently, and it's got some of the original lineup, like Necro Butcher, Jorn Stubberud. He's now back playing bass. I even believe Ketchel Mannheim actually came back, the original drummer, and I think he played a couple of shows too. He's not part of the lineup, but he did actually come in. But Ketchel went off to do stuff in media, I believe. I think he does like advertising or something. Like he totally really wasn't part of like that scene where he wanted to live out evil. I don't believe he wanted to live out evil. He was just a really good punk rock drummer. But I do really feel like this story really is about the power of our minds and how we can convince ourselves of certain things. And that's what I see with Varg, Oystein and Pelle. They're just characters, playing these characters for other people. Like, I don't believe either of those people were super true to themselves. And I think sometimes when people lean into these characters that they're playing, that it does become some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes reality because they believe it. But if they strip back that facade, I'm getting really deep here, people, they strip back that facade and they didn't care about what other people thought of them, they'd be completely different people. Anyway, that's just what I think. What do you think? Do you think these people are just playing characters, or do you think that they're mentally ill? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Let me know. I try to drop a video every week, if not every second week. Now, last week, I couldn't do it because I interviewed a former Underworld boss. Now, the video is on his channel. The link is in the description if you want to hear what a former Underworld boss has to say about life in prison and how dangerous that is. It was pretty wild, man. But yeah, if you liked the video, like the video. If you didn't, down thumb it. Leave me a comment. Thank you to everyone who commented on the last video about my production and stuff like that. It really does help. It really does. And I read all the comments and I take them on board. So thank you very much. If you're not subscribed, think about subscribing. And as always, stay safe out there in internet land.